Rootlessness is at the heart of so much spiritual distress and emotional distress these days. A 1500-year-old approach to spirituality can still offer some amazing advice that we should take really, really seriously. I'm David Lineker, and I'm going to lead you through a journey into approaching Benedictine spirituality with a secular mindset. Welcome. Spirituality these days is a little bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. There are an awful lot of shops and there's an awful lot of sweets. You can pick and mix from whatever you like. There's loads of stuff out there, loads of different traditions. Of course, in the last 50 years, we've become much more aware of the traditions of Eastern spirituality as well as our own Western traditions as well. And there's no more important thing that we could be doing at the moment because the world is a difficult and scary place to navigate. And it's really important to be in touch with the most fundamental elements of the nature of our human existence. So, what sweet shop do you go to and what sweets do you choose? In a way, this is no different to how it's always been. In the years when the old Roman Empire was crumbling and structures of authority within it were changing, religious allegiances within it were shifting dramatically, and all the old certainties were becoming very uncertain, and a world which had been quite safe was becoming very, very unsafe, particularly if you happen to live in the bit of Europe that was centered around Italy. And around about that time, so we're talking late 500s AD, an amazing document emerged. It was called the Rule of St Benedict. Now, we don't know a great deal about Benedict, but we know that he had been a spiritual teacher and a leader of monastic communities. And the rule comes out of his experience of leading those communities. The great genius of the rule is that it is fundamentally quite kind and it's fundamentally very flexible, whilst giving a really good framework for how people might live their lives. The result of what happened coming from that rule was that a monastic community was established, which then became incredibly important in the formation of what you might kind of pompously call the Western intellectual tradition. And so, whether we like it or not, the rule of St. Benedict has had a huge impact on how Western people in particular think about themselves and the world. It had an enormous impact on the way that subsequent philosophers worked and thought. It draws as much on Stoic ideas as it does on ones from the Christian scriptures and Hebrew scriptures and the milieu of the day. What I think is really, really useful when it comes to the rule of St. Benedict is that it is adaptable. I don't have a Christian belief, but I still find the rule of St Benedict really, really helpful, particularly as I am non-neurotypical. I have, I think, probably a fairly light version of ADD, but I've got it anyway. And so for me, having some sort of regulated, disciplined approach to my spirituality is really, really important. And I thought in this introductory video, I'd just introduce you to some basic principles of how Benedictine spirituality works and how it can be really, really useful for even those of us with no religious affiliation at all in terms of ordering our spiritual lives. You might be familiar with the vows that people take when they enter Christian communities such as the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Carmelites or one of those later orders. We don't call those monastic orders. Those are fraternal orders, mendicant orders, they're known as. The people in those orders move around, and they have a different way of looking at spirituality than, say, a Benedictine does. And you'll be familiar with those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That's what a Franciscan, for instance, would vow when entering community. Benedictine vows are slightly different. The word obedience still pops up, and I'll come back to that because that can be a really tricky word. But their threefold vows are stability, obedience, and conversion of life. So let's go through those one by one. Stability, for a Benedictine, what that means is they vow to stay in one place and to stick with the process. Now, that's where it's really, really useful in terms of our secular spirituality. Not that we would vow to literally stay in one house for the rest of our lives, although we might choose to do that, but it's quite unlikely. We would probably move around. But where it is really, really useful is it is about sticking with one particular process, identifying the rule as being a really useful way of shaping our spiritual life and then sticking with it. Why is that important? Well, Benedict starts his rule by looking at the way in which people tend to approach spirituality. And that's that pick and mix stuff I was talking about early on. People will come to it and they'll go, well, this looks really good. And then after a couple of weeks, I say, oh, this is quite boring, really. I have to keep doing this stuff. I have to keep sticking with this process when I don't really feel like it. Sometimes it makes me feel happy. Most of the time, I know I'm just kind of sticking with it. Thing is, if you don't stick with something, it doesn't have time to have any change in your life. You might have found that you've tried to change habits over the years, that you've tried to change the way you do things over the years. And you'll know from experience that it's only the things that you've done for a long time which begin to become habit forming. So when I first moved into this house and we had our two young puppies then, I began getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning in order to clean up the mess that the puppies made and then feed the pups. Now, it is an absolute habit that I'm out of bed every day at 6 o'clock in the morning to feed the dogs. That's what I do. It doesn't really occur to me to do anything else. And even when I'm away on holiday, I'm still up and awake at 6 o'clock in the morning because that's what I like to do. That's what my brain knows is my normal way of doing things. That's my regular habit. So it's only when you've been doing things in that case for now 8 years that those habits begin to become ingrained and they just become a natural thing in your life. So you've got to stick with it. So stability is a really useful vow to make. The other vow, the one that is in common with all the others, is obedience. Now, let's just think about that for a moment, because obedience can be a really tricky word. It can be an incredibly manipulative word. I'm sure we're all familiar with toxic forms of obedience. Obedience to authority figures who don't deserve our obedience, but enforce our obedience, either by manipulation or by violence. There may also be those of you who have experience of very high control religious environments, and you naturally bridle at the idea of any kind of spiritual obedience. But let me try to explain what Benedict means. Benedict certainly means that you would have a relationship of obedience with the abbot. So that's the leader of the monastic community. And he would also expect you to have an obedience to scripture. Now, that's not part of my worldview at all. But he also makes it really clear that this word obedience comes from a Latin root that means to listen. I think it's obedentia, but I wouldn't swear to that. My Latin is not fabulous. But the root is to listen. And the very first lines of the Rule of St Benedict are these: listen with the ear of your heart. Listen with the ear of your heart. So obedience isn't really about being told what to do and just doing it. Obedience is about recognizing that as human beings, we are interdependent. I think there's a temptation in the modern and postmodern world to think of ourselves as independent, that we can do it all, that we have it all, we can do it all. And the result of that is an awful mental health crisis, because people are lonely, they're scared, they're anxious, and yet they feel that they have to be able to do it all without reference to anybody else. No one's going to help them. No one's going to come to help them. There is something really cancerous about that in terms of the way we view ourselves and ourselves within society. Much more healthy is the idea that we have an interdependence. So a trivial but nonetheless important example of this is that at the moment my car's waiting to go into the garage, the workshop, some of you might call it, in order to have something really, really important fixed in the engine. Now, theoretically, I probably could learn how to do it and work out how to do it, but I'm not brilliant with mechanics. I can do very, very basic stuff, but nothing terribly complicated. And because of my ADD, my attention to detail is not brilliant, and therefore I'm quite likely to mess it up. It therefore makes sense that I hand that bit of my life in exchange for payment to a mechanic who knows what they're doing. Equally, there have been times in my life when life has kind of fallen apart a bit. And I've been deeply grateful for those who've looked after me, cared for me, just kind of messaged and said, "Are you okay?" They've maybe brought me food. They've maybe had me round to their house and listened to me and looked after me. That's a key element of interdependence. And that's what Benedict is getting at. He's getting at the encouraging a willingness in us to listen, to pay attention to our relationships so that we maintain that interdependence, which is such a critical part of our evolved heritage. It's who we are. If you think about it, we are who we are because of how we evolved on the African savannah. And the upshot of that is that we are interdependent. Denying that either means that we become dependent on others, and that can lead to a really unhealthy and toxic dependency on others, which can end up with a kind of learned helplessness. Or we become militantly independent, which can lead us to loneliness, anxiety, and deep mental health problems if we're not very careful. So learning interdependence, learning to be in community, however we shape that community, is a really important part of the rule. So we've had stability, sticking with the process, sticking with what we've committed ourselves to and not changing it just because it doesn't feel right today, giving it time to make a difference within us. And then we've looked at obedience. We've understood that properly in terms of a willingness to pay attention to our relationships and the interdependence of our lives. The final one, in Latin, it's conversio morum, and nobody has ever quite managed to perfectly translate that into English, but it comes up as something like conversion of life. Well, of course, those of us who don't have a religious outlook are not looking to be, as it were, converted to a religious belief. However, what we are very much interested in is what you might call these days a growth mindset. In other words, having a real interest in what is going to make me a better person, what is going to make me a better version of myself, but also what's going to mean that I can be a better contributor to the community that I am part of. How can I develop my natural gifts and talents? How can I be aware of the weaknesses and challenges that I have and make sure that those don't become toxic either to me or to other people? All part of having a growth mindset, which is part of this conversion of life, part of this willingness to change and to grow. So there you have the three pillars of Benedictine spirituality: stability, obedience, and conversion of life. And those pillars rest on, those three pillars, there's me three pillars, rest on a ground, a base. And that base, Benedict calls humility. Now, again, humility is a really loaded term, but it's also the longest chapter in the Rule of St Benedict. It's chapter 17, and it contains within it a ladder, hence the name of this series. And Benedict's understanding of humility is connected, you will see, to those three pillars that I have just outlined for you, because Benedict's idea of humility comes out of the Latin word on which humility is based: humus, earth. It's very earthy. It's very down to earth. Benedict is very realistic about people. In another chapter in the Rule, one of the famous chapters in the Rule, which is about monks' relationship with alcohol, And Benedict says, wine is no drink for monks, but since they can't be convinced of this, let them at least drink in moderation. And that gentleness, that willingness to say, do you know what? I can make a hard rule, but you're not going to follow it. So what's the point? I much more wisely give you some guidelines in which you might fulfill the principles of that rule, which is moderation. Because he's realistic about the human condition. He's realistic about what we're like, basically. But what he wants to do is he wants to encourage you to pay attention to your life. He wants to encourage you to pay attention to your strengths and weaknesses and be realistic about them. He wants you to pay attention to the things that you hide in secret, those shames that you hide in secret, which can so easily grab the steering wheel of your life and drive the car off into a ditch. And he wants you to be open about those in an appropriate way with an appropriate person so as to help you to keep your spiritual life grounded. And just as your inner life needs to embrace that sense of reality and self-awareness, so your interaction with others then becomes healthier and safer precisely because you are embracing the trickiness of your inner life. I remember somebody I worked with once saying that the goal when you're working with other people should always be that you are a safe person to work with. Yeah, you can challenge, you can take risks, you can do all sorts of things, but emotionally, you must be a safe person to be around. You mustn't be manipulative. You mustn't be hubristic, proud, arrogant, rude. You mustn't take people for granted. You must always recognize that they are human beings with hopes, dreams, fears, just like you. So humility is about realism. It's about being rooted in the good brown earth. So there you have an outline of Benedictine spirituality. And I hope you can see immediately that that is entirely applicable to anyone's spiritual journey. I believe it contains absolute genius. It hasn't survived for 1.5 millennia in one form or another without containing that genius. And I believe that it offers something really, really important to our modern spiritual journey. So I really hope that you enjoy the rest of this series. If you would like to engage with me further, please do leave a comment. Obviously, you know what to do with the little bell and the subscribe and all of that kind of malarkey, that you always get told what to do on videos like this. I'll leave that to you. But if you'd like to engage with me further, please do. Please drop me a comment. Please drop me a direct message. I'm always glad to receive those. And I will be keeping you informed with some initiatives which are going to be developing over the next few weeks, leading into the autumn of 2026, which will help you to be part of a community that will grow to explore these Benedictine principles and help to really enmesh them into your spiritual journey. So thank you for being a real trooper and hanging in to the end of this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.